My universe mode began back in WWE 13, and it has been going continuously for almost 5 years now. That's a lot of content for new viewers to try to catch up on, and as I've said in my Where You Should Start My Universe Mode video, I don't think that it's all necessarily worth watching. But even if I do give a starting point, like I gave a couple of different places where you could start in that video, and my ideal starting points that I recommended miss a lot of content from the previous game. So even if you do start and not watch all of it, you're going to be missing out on the context of what came before. So I have gotten requests, and I've been considering for a while the idea of a recap video, or a series of recap videos going through to chronicle the events in my universe mode, starting from all the way back in episode 1 of 13, all the way up to present day 2K17. But as you can tell by the title of this video, that's not all it's going to be. I want this series to be more than just a recap. I want to add a bit more flair to it. I want to give this series some more layers. So not only am I going to be recapping the events of each video game cycle, because that's how I'm going to space this out. It's going to be a series of episodes dedicated to each individual game, going all the way up from 13 to 2K17. But not only am I going to be recapping the events, I am going to compare Raw and SmackDown in each game and figure out who was the better brand. Of course, maybe I'll give my opinions on it, but if you, just listening to the recap, if you disagree with me, you can feel free to let me know down in the comments. But for a while, I've had this feeling that, or at least definitely in the very beginning, I think Raw had kind of the upper hand over SmackDown. Like, there was a very clear gap in terms of where my attention was, and I think the quality of each show. So I feel like going back and analyzing how my series has progressed and how the two shows have progressed can help me figure out what changes I need to make moving forward, what changes I have made, and how to, I guess, where my focus should be as far as the two brands go, and also show kind of how I've improved over the course of time. But that is not all, because I am also going to be ranking all of my pay-per-views from start to finish, the best to the worst. Although, I guess since we're starting with WWE 13, it's, as far as chronologically goes, we're going to be starting with the worst, so it's more like worst to best, but you get the idea. As far as how this series is going to be structured, I'm going to jump from pay-per-view to pay-per-view. I'm not going to go through each individual episode to recap what happens, but in talking about the matches, like discussing the matches on each pay-per-view, I can kind of go by memory as to how I got to that point. Because I don't feel as though, I think it'd be a little boring to actually go through each individual episode and recap everything that happened there, because especially in WWE 13, there's a lot of garbage in there. You've got the Attitude Era show, which I could probably dedicate a separate video to that, but you've got the Attitude Era show, which I have covered it in Pretend It Never Happened a bit, that it was really pointless, and it was counterintuitive to the whole idea of what my series was going to be moving forward. Then you had the UCW brands, which, I mean, that was it. That's a discussion for another time. But there's just so much to cover in WWE 13, and that's the problem I'm going to run into with trying to do anything chronologically with this Behind the Universe series, is that WWE 13, it was such a terrible starting point for the series. But if I do anything chronologically, I have to start with it. So the format of how this is going to work out moving forward, it starts off rough. It's any series I do talking about my universe mode is going to have a rough beginning, because that first year was a very rough beginning for universe mode. There's so much to try to wrap your head around, and none of it makes any sense. I mean, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel once we get down the stretch of the game, but in the very beginning, no, it was not good. So let's jump into the very first pay-per-view in universe mode, that is Extreme Rules. When I first got started, every once in a while I would host a pre-show before the pay-per-views, which this is something that I've stopped doing. I've completely cut it from my series. I think the last one I had was in 2K15, but really the idea of the pre-shows, they're kind of pointless when you're making YouTube videos, I feel, because you can just tack everything onto one show. I mean, it's not like a WWE pay-per-view where there is a 3-hour limit or 2-hour limit, whatever, how much time they have, and they have to basically stick within that time frame. Of course, with the WWE Network, that's a little less a little less of a priority because they have their own network they can run over as much as they want. But with the pre-show, it's mainly stuff that can't fit on the main show because there's no time. I did a 6-hour WrestleMania pay-per-view, so cutting that into 2 separate videos and having like a pre-show for, I just don't think it's necessary when I could just make it all one project. But with Extreme Rules, I had a pre-show, and it wasn't a good one. The first ever match tied to a pay-per-view on this pre-show was 3MB versus Tons of Funk and Rey Mysterio. Mysterio, I guess, was making his official debut to the series, and that was the big surprise reveal, was that Tons of Funk were going to face 3MB and have a mystery partner, and it was Rey Mysterio, which, you know, if you want to bring in Rey Mysterio, introduce him to the series, that's, you know, the surprise reveal part of it is a good start, but this isn't really not a brand exclusive matchup because 3MB was on Raw, but I think Jinder Mahal was SmackDown. I don't even remember what Heath Slater was, but I know that Drew McIntyre was on Raw because he was involved in like a number 1 contenders match to figure out who was going to be the next United States Championship number 1 contender. And yeah, McIntyre was in there, Swagger was in there, and maybe Zack Ryder. Yeah, because I think that's where the alliance between Ryder and Swagger formed, was because Ryder, I got this cut scene in the middle of the match where I believe it was Zack Ryder threw Swagger a chair and he hit Drew McIntyre in the head with it, and that's how Swagger became the number 1 contender, which he went on to face Santino on this pay-per-view for the U.S. title. Yeah, Santino Marella was the first U.S. champion. I covered that in the Pretend It Never Happened episode. We all know that I don't like Santino Marella. The fact that he was the U.S. champion, I wanted to get that belt off of him as soon as possible. But this pre-show match, not brand exclusive, and there's going to be a couple of these non-brand exclusive matchups that I cover on pay-per-views. I could ignore them entirely if I just wanted to gauge Raw and SmackDown, but again, I'm trying to compare all of these pay-per-views as we go along. So you're going to figure out, like, with this, obviously each episode I'm only going to have as many pay-per-views as I've covered. So with WWE 13, we'll figure out which is the best pay-per-view in WWE 13 out of the 4 of these that are here. Because I'm not going to talk about the Attitude Era pay-per-views. I'm not going to talk about the UCW exclusive pay-per-views. No, I'll save those for some other time. Because if I want to compare Raw and SmackDown and also throw in these other shows, I think that's going to get too convoluted. So this pre-show match was garbage. It was not brand exclusive, so I can't really give points to anyone there. 3MB picked up the win over Tons of Funk and Rey Mysterio, so that was a great debut for Mysterio to the series. Really got maximum mileage out of him. So then moving on to the actual card, we start off the show with what would become a tradition for a long time in this series, and that was the United States Championship matchup kicking off the show. This, of course, being between Santino Marella and Jack Swagger. Not really a matchup to write home about. Jack Swagger defeated Santino Marella with a gut-wrench powerbomb and became the new U.S. champion. So Santino, that was really I believe that was his last shot ever at a championship. And the only reason he had it was because he was the default champion. And I thought starting with the default champions was a good idea because I had no creativity at the time. I didn't know how to start a universe mode. So that was it for Santino. He was done before he could really even start. After that match, we had Dolph Ziggler versus Zack Ryder. This was, I believe, building off of Dolph Ziggler and Jack Swagger back in the real WWE were tag team partners at one point, and I somehow that factored into them splitting up in my universe mode, and Zack Ryder aligning with Jack Swagger, I think, was what kind of killed that tag team for me, because I don't remember if I had actually tried to book them as a team, but just because Ryder jumped in, I was like, oh, Ziggler and Swagger were a tag team around this time, or at least they were before in the real WWE, so that's a good place to start a storyline. Ziggler is upset that Ryder stole Swagger from him, so these two had a match, and Ziggler went on to defeat Zack Ryder. Again, it was an match. None of these early matches were anything really memorable because it was either the AI was controlling it or I was playing against the AI. I have really no memories of the actual matches from WWE 13, which you could say, yeah, it's due to time, but if there was anything memorable about them, I would I would remember at least that moment in particular. But WWE 13 didn't really have moments like that, especially not these early matchups. So Ziggler ends up defeating Zack Ryder, starting to get storylines in motion there. This would later lead to Dolph Ziggler getting a shot at the United States Championship. So I guess it was good in that it set something up there. There was also a Divas Championship match between Beth Phoenix and Karma. I really liked the crop of divas we had in WWE 13 back when they were divas and not women, because, you know, the Divas division, we all know the Divas division. And but at this point, I want to say that, like, the group of women I had at this point, the Divas division in WWE 13 in my universe mode was better than what came after it with 2K14 and especially 2K15. Starting out with Beth Phoenix as the champion. Beth Phoenix actually didn't have a terrible reign. I did like her as the champion. I thought she was a great place to start. And back when you had women like Karma stepping up to face Beth Phoenix, I really liked the idea of this match. It might not have been necessarily anything to write home about, but Beth Phoenix ends up defeating Karma. This is going to set up a potential match at Over the Limit, but it was non-brand exclusive because I don't remember what shows these women were on. Like, yeah, I think Karma and Beth Phoenix were technically Raw superstars, but back then, I mean, even the main superstars flopped shows left and right. Like, I know CM Punk and Santina Marella were in a tag match on SmackDown against, I think I did like I don't remember what I did. It was like the Intercontinental Champion and World Heavyweight Champion against the US Champion and the WWE Champion or something like that. I came up with some sort of weird tag team. You had Raw superstars appearing on SmackDown, SmackDown appearing on Raw. The first month or two was just really, there was no consistency in terms of where people what shows they would appear on. Because I think I had Del Rio, who was a SmackDown superstar, attacking Chris Jericho at one point on Raw. Nothing made any sense. So the Divas division, really this whole game, the Divas division, wasn't much that it really stuck. It took a little while to actually get the brands in order, and you could partially attribute that to the UCW invasion angle, which comes up later on, because then, well, a lot of people got pushed to the background. Well, I'll delve more into that later, but Divas title match wasn't bad, but it didn't really go to a brand, so I can't really give points to it. The Intercontinental Championship was defended by The Miz in a triple threat match against Cody Rhodes and Christian. The Miz suffers from the same problem as Santina Marella and arguably Sheamus at this point. Sheamus has his own can of worms to dig into, but The Miz and Santina Marella, I did not want them to have the titles, so my goal was to try to get the belts off of them as soon as possible. However, with this match, there was at least a decent storyline going into it, because Cody Rhodes was in a rivalry with Christian, and Christian, I believe he was in the big World Heavyweight Championship tournament I had going with Sheamus, and he got knocked out of that. So I put him in a match with Justin Gabriel, I think is what ended up happening. So Christian became the number one contender, and then Cody Rhodes, because he was in a rivalry with Christian at the time, ended up attacking him after the match or something. So Rhodes got his way into this matchup as well. And what this matchup does, I have revisited this recently, trying to make a callback to this very first Intercontinental Championship matchup. But this was because when the series first began, I used the white belt Intercontinental Championship. But then at this pay-per-view, I switched it back to the 2003 to 2011. I don't remember how long they had that title around. It was the Intercontinental Championship when I first got into WWE. So I really liked the design, and I thought the white belt just clashed with everything else. So I got rid of it. I used that championship for the majority of the series. I only recently changed it back. But even that, the fact that it changed was a callback to this matchup where it was The Miz who changed the title, and Christian goes on to win this matchup. He wins the triple threat. But I do call back to this later in 2K17 when Cody Rhodes ended up switching the title back, and I played it off as, oh, well, that was the title that Rhodes was pursuing in the first place. So I thought that was kind of cool. This is nothing that I could have ever predicted at this point in the series, but as far as the matches, in terms of build-up goes, for all the matches I've covered on this pay-per-view, this one probably has one of the better build-ups, but it's not saying a whole lot because my booking wasn't great, wasn't even good, not even decent in the early part of the series. But as far as on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad was it? This is more on the upper end of the scale in that it's better than everything else before it, but I still wouldn't say it's great. Then Sheamus defended his World Heavyweight Championship against Alberto Del Rio. Del Rio won the big tournament to dethrone Sheamus that I talked about in a previous Pretend It Never Happened video. So I obviously wanted to get the title off of Sheamus. I had this whole tournament completely breaking the immersion, completely breaking kayfabe, like, yeah, we got to get this belt off of Sheamus, and that's what happened. Del Rio defeated Sheamus here, won the World Heavyweight Championship, but his title reign was short-lived because he would lose it at the next pay-per-view. So the whole idea of getting the belt off of Sheamus, I had this whole tournament, could have been a big storyline that whoever defeated Sheamus would have this big reign. Del Rio, he had the setup to do it, but he didn't. So the whole tournament was a waste. This match was a waste. Like, if I was going to do this, Sheamus should have just kept the belt, because then you wind up with Sheamus being, by the end of things, a 3-time World Heavyweight Champion. None of his reigns were really that memorable. So there's a lot I could say to harp on this. But then we move into the main event, the WWE title match between CM Punk and Chris Jericho. Jericho was kind of a random opponent for this matchup. He defeated CM Punk on an episode of Raw in a match, so that was how he got the shot at the title. But because CM Punk was jumping over between Raw and SmackDown, and everyone was getting involved in everything, like Del Rio attacking Jericho, nothing made sense. So this did not have a great build-up at all. I mean, Jericho getting a win over Punk, it was just kind of a way to shoehorn him into this match. Like, I guess Jericho... No, now that I think about it, I held this battle royal to determine a number one contender. It had guys like John Cena, The Undertaker was in it way back when, and Jericho won that battle royal. But then I pulled the WWE trope of having your big pay-per-view opponents face off on Raw the week before the pay-per-view. So the build-up was terrible. Jericho lost his match with CM Punk. Punk retained the title. And for a main event, again, like, for my standards back then, it wasn't bad, but it was bad. Like, in the grand scheme of things, Extreme Rules, very forgettable. Not a great pay-per-view, not at all. Who do I give the edge to? I have to give it to SmackDown, because as terrible as the tournament to dethrone Sheamus was, it was still a storyline. Like, with all the matches on Raw, like with Swagger, he just kind of won a match to become number one contender. Jericho just won a match to become number one contender. There wasn't really a storyline between them. Ziggler and Ryder, I kind of just threw that in there. There wasn't really much to speak of there. Oh, now that I think about it, I forgot the other match, the Tag Team Championship match that was on this pay-per-view. It was Air Boom versus Team Hell No. Technically, that was a SmackDown exclusive match as well, so that's only going to boost SmackDown. But I've covered that situation, the idea with the tag team titles, how R-Truth got replaced with Evan Bourne. The whole storyline is really ugh. But hey, it was another match for SmackDown. It wasn't total garbage. That would come later on at Over the Limit. But SmackDown, like, there's at least a semblance of, like, there are some semblances of storylines going into this pay-per-view, whereas with Raw, it was just kind of a game of chance. Like, there wasn't really much going on there. So, as far as Extreme Rules goes, I gotta give a point to SmackDown here, but there's not a huge difference here. It's like saying, oh, there were storylines. They weren't good storylines, but they were there, so it's a matter of just being slightly less incompetent than the other show at this point. But then we move into Over the Limit, where really a lot of these early pay-per-views I want to say were bad, but Over the Limit really set a precedent for how this series would continue for the rest of the game, at least. On the pre-show, we had the Tag Team Championship match between Air Boom against Zack Ryder and R-Truth. I covered that and Pretend It Never Happened. It was terrible. Ryder and Truth they won the match. No, wait, I don't even remember who won the match. But after the match, Kofi and Truth, like, it was... the whole cutscene that took place after that was just garbage. Then Ryder ended up running over Truth, and Truth was injured for the longest time. And then I had to vacate the tag titles because the storyline was so bad and I had no idea where to go with it. So, that match was terrible, but it wasn't really brand exclusive because Air Boom was SmackDown, R-Truth was SmackDown, but Zack Ryder was Raw. So, it didn't really make much sense. It was just kind of giving... Somehow I managed to throw R-Truth into the faction with Jack Swagger and Zack Ryder. It just wasn't good. Then on the pre-show, you had the team of Jericho Miz taking on The Shield in The Shield's debut. And this really isn't brand exclusive either because The Miz was SmackDown, Jericho was Raw, I think Big Show was SmackDown, so there's still not really a whole lot of not understanding the concept of brand. Like, superstars were on brands, but it was like the Super Show way that WWE was using for a while, where SmackDown superstars could appear on Raw as well. And I kind of ran with that for a bit until I realized, no, this is terrible. I should just have exclusive brands. So that's what I eventually did. First couple of months, no, like these first 2 months, there was no brand exclusion. Like, everybody could show up anywhere. None of it made any sense. The Shield won this match. They defeated Jericho Miz. So, in that regard, at least I didn't screw up the Shield's debut. But, I don't know, the way it began, as a way to bring in the Shield, to have as impactful as their debut was in the real WWE at Survivor Series, taking out Ryback, taking out John Cena. This is not an impactful debut. This is not one of those moments. Not a match that you would remember. And the final match on the pre-show was for the Intercontinental Championship, Christian defending the gold against Hunico. Hunico defeated Justin Gabriel to become the number one contender. I think Cody Rhodes might have been in that match. I think it might have been a triple threat number one contenders. But again, I had no plan. Cody Rhodes should have won the match, but Hunico won it, so he got the match. You can tell why it's on the pre-show because this match means nothing. It was just Christian's got to have an opponent for the title, so Hunico is an opponent. For some reason, I made this pre-show bigger than the last one, and I don't think it helped quality-wise. Like, yeah, there's more to look into, so it's not as, like, there are higher spots because it's 3 matches instead of 1, but there are also lower moments, like the tag title match. It was terrible. One of the worst moments ever in the entire series. And then you just kind of have a forgettable Intercontinental Championship match. But when we get into the actual pay-per-view, we continue the tradition, starting off with the U.S. title match, Jack Swagger versus Dolph Ziggler. This matchup had a storyline going into it, but again, I played my cards too early. Jack Swagger and Dolph Ziggler competed in, it was either a steel cage or it might have even been a Hell in a Cell match on an episode of Monday Night Raw before their title match, and it did, I was taking too many tips from WWE, and they weren't good tips to begin with, but I didn't realize that at the time, so it was just not good. Not good. This one had a storyline, but much like with the Sheamus Del Rio thing, it wasn't a good storyline. Like, yeah, there was one there, it existed, but nothing great. Swagger would retain the title against Dolph Ziggler. Nothing really to say about this match. Then we jump into some UCW matches, which I'm not going to cover here. John Cena faces Xander James, one of these UCW superstars, in a ladder match. But I'm going to save that for another time. It doesn't contribute anything to the Raw versus SmackDown theme, and the storylines just weren't good. This is a whole pretend it never happened episode we're looking at right here with this whole UCW invasion angle. But it's not worth discussing here. I could go on a full rant about this, and I don't want to do that. So then there was another match, John Morrison versus Therm, the UCW heavyweight champion. I guess the John Cena match was representing Raw, and John Morrison was representing SmackDown. Cena was Raw. But no, they weren't good. They're not going to contribute any points to any of these brands. Then you had a Divas Championship triple threat match between Beth Phoenix, Karma, and AJ Lee. This is again a non-brand exclusive match because people flip-flop all over the place. However, this was building off of the Divas Championship match from Extreme Rules, which I really like, and this will also lead into really 2 separate storylines heading into Capital Punishment, the next pay-per-view. Beth Phoenix retains the title here. We're going to get a going to continue a rivalry with Karma and AJ Lee. So, again, when I say that the Divas division was better here than it was later on, it really was, because I had actual storylines happening, even if they might not have been great storylines, but you've got multiple women being thrown into the mix, as opposed to just people who are in the championship picture. I mean, yeah, this was for the championship, but Capital Punishment kind of builds on that with getting AJ Lee versus Karma, but at least it's something. Like, again, as far as the measuring stick of quality goes, I haven't set a very high standard thus far, so of course, this is going to seem better than what has come before, because nothing that came before was any good. And then we move into our two main events, the World Heavyweight Championship match between Alberto Del Rio, Sheamus, and Daniel Bryan. This was basically just leftovers from Extreme Rules. Sheamus lost to Del Rio, so he's got to get a rematch. We have to get that rematch clause out of the way. And I threw Daniel Bryan in there just to kind of mix things up. Last pay-per-view, he was teaming with Kane as a part of Team Hell No, and he lost that match, and he just kind of gets rushed into this world title match. Again, not very good. As far as the storyline goes, nothing really noteworthy there. Then was Raw's main event, the proper main event of the show. CM Punk versus Brock Lesnar for the WWE title. Again, the storyline was there. It existed. I don't remember anything from it, which just kind of shows, I mean, at least if I'm not remembering anything from it, that means it's not so terrible that it makes me want to tear my eyes out of my sockets and light them on fire, but being meh is better than being worse in some regard, but then also, sometimes being worse, like failing horribly, is better because it's at least memorable. This feud, this match wasn't memorable. So as far as Over the Limit CM Punk retains, he defeats Brock Lesnar. As far as Over the Limit goes, I'd have to say, honestly, it's worse than Extreme Rules. Like, yeah, Extreme Rules didn't have very many strong storylines going into it, but neither really did this pay-per-view. You had the Divas title storyline, you had Swagger and Ziggler, and then you had the whole UCW thing, which really drags this pay-per-view down immensely. So Over the Limit, worse than Extreme Rules. I will give Extreme Rules credit there. It doesn't fail quite as hard, even if it is forgettable. It's not as awful, as completely despicable as this show. And between Raw and SmackDown, I have to give the edge to Raw, just because they had the US title match had at least some semblance of a rivalry going into it, whereas the World Heavyweight title match was just kind of, Sheamus needs a rematch clause, but I don't want to do a repeat of Extreme Rules, so we'll throw Daniel Bryan in there. It just wasn't good. Raw gets the point here. Then we move on to the third pay-per-view of this game cycle, Capital Punishment. This pay-per-view benefited from not having a pre-show to weigh it down, and I can say the same for Vengeance. Dropping the pre-shows was a great idea. I don't know why I ever brought them back, but the good thing for Capital Punishment, in its defense, is that there was no pre-show. However, this pay-per-view, in some ways, even worse than Over the Limit. You've still got the UCW versus WWE storyline going strong, taking up 3 matches on this pay-per-view instead of 2. You get John Cena versus Therm. You get Xander James versus Tensai. You get John Morrison versus Brian Cole, another UCW superstar. I could give these as like Raw, SmackDown exclusive matchups just based on the superstars competing in it, but really, the UCW versus WWE storyline, people were jumping shows left and right. People were showing up on UCW shows even though they were WWE guys. UCW guys were showing up on WWE shows. This storyline was just a mess, so I can't really count these as representing any of the brands, either of them. The show began once again with the United States title match, Jack Swagger versus Big E. This was, I guess, kind of carrying leftovers with the Dolph Ziggler storyline, because Big E and Dolph Ziggler were a faction back then. They were a team. AJ Lee wasn't involved in this group, I don't believe, at least not in my universe mode. But Big E he just kind of won a number 1 contenders match. It was a fatal 4-way with Kofi Kingston, the Great Khali, Drew McIntyre, I think, was the 4th guy. It really was a forgettable number 1 contenders match. No storyline going into this. It's just another somebody won a match to become number 1 contender, so they get a title shot. This is the problem that a lot of my early booking has, is that it's just like, oh, some guy has to challenge for a title, and that's my idea of a storyline. Every pay-per-view seems to have had multiple instances of this. However, this pay-per-view, because it doesn't really have as many title matches to speak of, it doesn't get the opportunity to fail that much. But this show only has 3 title matches. Like, the World Heavyweight title isn't defended. The Intercontinental title isn't defended here. The tag team titles still don't exist because that storyline ruined them. You have AJ Lee versus Karma, which wasn't a bad match, but it wasn't as good as the Divas title match between Beth Phoenix and Natalya, which again, I'm not going to give brand exclusive credit because Beth Phoenix was Raw, Natalya was technically SmackDown. Natalya defeated Beth Phoenix and became the new Divas champion, which was, I guess it was good. I would have preferred Beth Phoenix to hold the title for a bit longer, but Beth Phoenix ultimately wasn't in 2K14, so if anybody had to get the title, I'd say Natalya was a good pick. I believe it was AJ Lee who defeated Karma, but the match is so forgettable that I honestly don't even remember what happened. It had no impact on anything moving forward, because Natalya would face Beth Phoenix again at Vengeance, because Beth Phoenix has to get her rematch clause. So whoever won this Capital Punishment match, I did nothing with them as far as trying to push them towards the title or some other storyline. It just kind of was a way to give this feud a payoff, and that it ended, that it had a chance to conclude in a match, but there was nothing to result from it, so there was really no point in continuing it. AJ Lee versus Karma, I will give credit to Raw because they both were Raw superstars at that point. And then you have the main event for the WWE title, CM Punk versus Dean Ambrose. This matchup actually had a storyline going into it because the Shield at this point, I decided, oh, somebody should be a WWE champion in the Shield. Like, they should be the next guys to challenge for it, because the Shield were running amok in the real WWE, so I had to replicate that. I had to give them a push. And for some reason, I was so fixated on getting Dean Ambrose this title shot, because he had a chance to become #1 contender. He had a match against CM Punk to do it, and he lost. So then I was like, okay, I don't even remember if I gave him a second shot. I might have. But ultimately, Seth Rollins would become the #1 contender. He defeated CM Punk in a match. But instead of just giving Seth Rollins the title shot, I made a switch at the end of the show and gave it to Dean Ambrose for some reason. I don't know why. There was no reason to do it. Seth Rollins versus CM Punk would have been fine. Rollins could have just... I don't know why Dean Ambrose had to get the shot. I don't know why Dean Ambrose had to win the match, because he did. He defeated CM Punk. It shouldn't have happened. This never should have happened. Again, one of the worst moments in the series. Dean Ambrose getting the WWE title this early in his career. And I would ultimately do nothing with his title run. It was garbage. And what I would actually do with it was... I would have wished that I did nothing with it. So, Capital Punishment, I'm going to give it to Raw because what SmackDown matches were there? What SmackDown exclusive matches existed on this pay-per-view? I'm looking at my notes and it's just, because there's nothing. The world title wasn't defended. The Intercontinental title wasn't defended. SmackDown was a complete non-entity in this pay-per-view. So it's going to go to Raw by default, but Capital Punishment, it's worse. It's even worse than anything that's come before it. Like, yeah, no, there's nothing redeeming about this show. It's even worse than Over the Limit. So Extreme Rules, my very first pay-per-view, I guess isn't my worst like I might have initially thought it was going into this video. And then comes Vengeance, which is thankfully a bit of it's a bit of saving grace for WWE 13. There's still a little bit of baggage from the WWE UCW storyline, but it really only affects one match on this show. Everything else is back to business. We're trying to set up a strictly WWE Universe mode in 2K14, so I was finally starting to trim the fat. We're getting UCW out of the picture, letting them do their own thing, let WWE move on, because I was not going to bring UCW back for 2K14. I knew that. And if I was at the time, I thought, well, I would just do 2 separate universe modes, which I did do for a while. I ended up continuing the WWE 13 stuff with UCW. That went on for a good while, a couple months after the game was actually done. But because I was actually focusing on the WWE roster and not worrying about this big invasion angle, the pay-per-view actually had a chance to breathe. It had an actual chance to build storylines, to have something going for it. The show opens with the Tag Team Championship match between Dolph Ziggler and Big E taking on Jack Swagger and Zack Ryder. Actually, I was wrong. The tradition wasn't that the US title would kickstart the show. the tradition was that Jack Swagger was always in the opening match of the pay-per-view, and it has continued thus far through 13, and it's going to continue to do so in 2K14. That tradition will go on for quite some time. But because the UCW storyline was finally coming to an end, I had room to actually bring back the tag team titles to take up some more space on the card, and this actually had a rivalry going into it, because you had Dolph Ziggler and Big E, who had been... Ziggler had faced Zack Ryder at Extreme Rules. Jack Swagger had fought Dolph Ziggler for the US title at Over the Limit, fought Big E at Capital Punishment. So there was build-up for this. It might not have been great compared to what I've done after the fact, but it was build-up nonetheless, and I will give it credit for that. The match was ultimately won by Jack Swagger and Zack Ryder. They would win the tag team titles and go on to hold them for not very long. Their title reign wasn't that impressive either, but that's for next time. Natalya faced Beth Phoenix in a rematch, which she retained her title against. This gave me the chance to write Beth Phoenix out of the series. The match, I don't know if it improved on their Capital Punishment match. They were ultimately forgettable, but it was non-brand exclusive once again because Natalya SmackDown, Beth Phoenix Raw. Christian defended his Intercontinental Championship against Curtis Axel. This matchup had a bit of build-up to it, not much, because again, it's another one of those... Axel debuted, and he won a number one contenders match. I don't remember who he even faced, but he won the match. Maybe he won a couple of matches to become number one contender. I don't even remember if there was a number one contenders match, but Axel got a shot at Christian and lost. Christian retained, and it's another one of those, we have to have a challenger for a champion rivalries. It's ultimately forgettable. Then you had a tag team match representing Raw. It was Daniel Bryan and CM Punk taking on Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns of The Shield. This was what kickstarted the whole CM Punk versus Daniel Bryan rivalry. It was Bryan wanted a match with CM Punk. Vince wouldn't give it to him. Instead, he put them together on a team to face The Shield at Vengeance. And while I guess for the beginning to one of my biggest rivalries in Universe Mode history, it's not a great beginning. Even as far as a standalone storyline goes, leading into this match, what really kind of beef did they have with The Shield? CM Punk had fought Dean Ambrose for the title. He lost his title to Ambrose, but this was one of those instances where I didn't actually give him his rematch for once. I let him do something else. So I actually can't say that I dislike this match. Technically, as far as the match itself goes, it's forgettable. There's not much that I remember from it. I was going to say there might have been a spot where where Reigns speared Punk off the stage, but that was in the build-up to it. It was just a cutscene. Wasn't in the actual match. But the match itself, at the time, was probably one of the better matches I've put on in Universe Mode. The storyline was definitely one of the most well-constructed storylines of the time. Looking back on it, it's kind of weak compared to what I've done since then. But as far as at this point in the series, I think this might have been one of the best build pay-per-view matches and one of the ones that delivered on its potential, whatever potential that was. The Shield would ultimately defeat Daniel Bryan and CM Punk and continue their winning streak. Then you had the World Heavyweight Championship match between Sheamus and Wade Barrett. It was really low on the card. I don't really know why. This matchup, there was a slight build-up to it, but ultimately, you know that Sheamus and Wade Barrett go on to become allies. So I guess the idea with these two is that they started off as competitors. They were both really hard-hitting superstars, and I was a big Wade Barrett mark back in the day when he was still with the company. So I really wanted Barrett to win the world title. I've been out for Sheamus ever since the beginning of the series at this point. But Barrett would ultimately lose to Sheamus here, unfortunately, because I would have liked to see Barrett pick up the strap. And Barrett never would go on to win the world title in this Universe Mode, which I have to say I'm a bit bitter about it, because I really liked Wade Barrett. I thought he could have been a good champion. This was the time for him to take it, and because I didn't control everything, Sheamus won it in the AI match. And so I just stuck with it because I didn't do retakes. The storyline, going into it, it would build up to something bigger at SummerSlam, so I will give it credit for that. But as far as top-tier world title matches go, you will not see this near the top of any list. after that was a triple threat between Edge, Randy Orton, and Mark Henry, which makes me question why this match went on directly after the World Heavyweight Championship match. Like, yeah, I guess it was supposed to be a cool down from SmackDown's big main event attraction, but I don't know, it's just weird that it would be placed after the fact. It was, I guess, like, meant to be a number one contenders type thing, but I would ultimately go on to attempt to build a championship scramble at SummerSlam, which would include Randy Orton and Mark Henry in that match. But it was Randy Orton who won this triple threat. He defeated, I think he pinned Edge in this match. But it was Orton who won. He defeated two of SmackDown's top challengers. And the thing with this was, back with the tournament to crown the number one contender for Sheamus going into Extreme Rules, I had all these guys like Edge, Randy Orton, Rob Van Dam. I had a lot of superstars brought in. I think Ryback even showed up. But I did nothing with them. They just disappeared for a while because with this big UCW storyline taking center stage, a lot of these guys just disappeared. So it wasn't until around this time, going into Vengeance, that guys like Edge and Randy Orton came back. And so I think that's why I put this matchup on, was because star power. It's Edge and Randy Orton, and they're back. They were gone for whatever reason for the longest time. So then they came back, and I made this match. And ultimately it didn't really do much because 2 out of these 3 guys would end up getting a world title match at the next pay-per-view anyway. So it wasn't really a personal storyline. There wasn't even really a storyline going into it. It was just, here are 3 top guys. They can have a match. It's a match on a pay-per-view. That happened. And then you have the main event, which I've thrown around the term worst match or worst moment in Universe Mode history quite a lot in this video alone, and there are other moments later on which could potentially vie for that title, but this might take the cake. This might be the ultimate culmination of the WWE versus UCW storyline, Dean Ambrose versus Therm, the WWE champion versus the UCW champion. And the match was awful. The match ended in like 46 seconds. It was off a roll-up, because back then, the way the game worked was that if the AI got into the roll-up animation, they would kick out of the first, they'd kick out of the second, and they'd get pinned on the third. It never failed. That would always happen. If you got into it was any of those that had that kind of exchange in it where it was specifically just 3 times. If it was like an inside cradle or something like that, they'd sometimes get stuck in it. But where it was actually like a reversal sequence, like roll up after roll up, like you get out of the schoolboy into the bridge and then you go into the backslide. With the O'Connor roll, it's just kind of a 3 sequence exchanging of like whoever's in the top position. I don't know. But Ambrose won it off a roll-up. This was the big conclusion, the big climax to the WWE versus UCW storyline, and that's how it ended, on a roll-up. For how much praise I want to give this pay-per-view, that moment really drags it down. I think it's hard to deny that I'd have to say it's a toss-up between the tag title situation and this moment, this match, for being the worst moment in the entire series. Because, like, with the tag title match, it's convoluted as hell. You can't make heads or tails of it no matter how you look at it. But at least it didn't have any grand storyline significance with it. Like, it wasn't I didn't have this big storyline going on for months leading up to this moment, only to not deliver on it with this matchup. Yeah, Ambrose would get a rematch with Therm at the next UCW pay-per-view, which was Overboard, which was a better match because it actually was a match. It didn't just end on a roll-up, but still terrible. This match was terrible. But ultimately, I'd have to say that Vengeance was the best pay-per-view of WWE 13, because for how terrible that main event was, everything else wasn't that bad. You had a storyline going into the tag team title match. You had what was probably the best storyline at this point going into the Daniel Bryan and CM Punk versus The Shield match. You at least had a storyline going into Ambrose versus Therm. Sheamus and Barrett was meh, but it wasn't terrible. Christian and Curtis Axel was meh, but it wasn't terrible. Natalya versus Beth Phoenix was a rematch, but it was, again, just forgettable, not terrible. And Edge, Randy Orton, Mark Henry didn't really mean a whole lot, but it didn't really drag down the show either. It wasn't like it wasn't offensively bad. It was just kind of a match that happened. And while Extreme Rules didn't really have as many technical failures as Over the Limit or Capital Punishment, there wasn't really much to write home about with Extreme Rules either. At least with Vengeance, something is starting here. I'm actually starting to finally get a grasp of how to run this universe mode thing. I still have some of my bad booking habits that I developed over the course of the entire WWE 13 series, but I was slowly starting to drop those habits. And for that reason alone, I think Vengeance I can comfortably say that it was the best pay-per-view of WWE 13. It's going to be nowhere near the top of the list of greatest pay-per-view in my series by any means, because it's still bad. It's still not a good show. But it was like, when you look at a bunch of 1 out of 10s, and then you look at Vengeance, you think, yeah, 1.5, maybe a 2, because maybe Extreme Rules is a 1.5, Vengeance maybe a 2 out of 10. It's better than the worst of the series, but doesn't make it great, doesn't even make it good. And I have to give the edge to Monday Night Raw here, because while, yeah, Dean Ambrose was representing Raw, it was the WWE title, Raw's big champion, terrible moment, but at least, like, I talked about matches actually having storylines going into it. The two matches that had storylines going into it, the two that I really talked up on this pay-per-view, were both Raw exclusives, the tag title match and the Bryan and Punk versus The Shield match. So without a doubt, the point goes to Raw here. So that's going to give Raw the advantage through WWE 13. They got a 3-1 edge over SmackDown. And I have a feeling that trend is only going to continue as we move into WWE 2K14. Thank you for joining me for this first episode of Raw versus SmackDown. I'm still going to try to work out the kinks of this format. It's a bit of a long one, but I have a feeling all the episodes are going to be like this because, like I said, yeah, doing the recap would take up enough time in its own right, but I'm trying to add some layers to this. I'd like to go in depth with it. So I was expecting this series to be, like, each episode is going to be long. This one might actually be one of the shorter episodes. Like, yeah, I had to do the whole setup of what the series is going to be, but as far as pay-per-views go, there were only 4 that I talked about here because, the calendar of WWE 13 was such a cluster. There really were only 4 exclusively WWE shows, and even then, they weren't WWE exclusive because you had UCW crap in there. But the UCW storyline, that's going to be an entire video. I have an entire video to write on just that alone because there's so much to dig into with that. When I talk about UCW, when I talk about how terrible it was, I am going to do it episode by episode. I am going to go into the fine details of that storyline just to show you how terrible it was. And to get the climax like that, which doesn't deliver on anything, any potential promise that that arc had to offer, no. I have to show you. I have to show you every nook and cranny of how terrible this thing is. Just so you know that, hey, even if your universe mode is bad, if you need to get some experience, if you're just starting out, you cannot be worse than I was. As far as how frequently these are going to come out, I don't really know. I'd like to get the 2K14 episode up soon, but at the same time, if these are spaced out more, it's better because then I'm not going to run out of material as fast, because eventually I will catch up. If I made these one a year, that's the only way that I wouldn't catch up. Like, if I posted one now and waited 6 months to do 2K14, and then, like, eventually I would catch up, because the games only cycle out once per year, so even if I did this, like, 2 times a year, I would catch up. Because while I have been doing this for 5 years, that's only 5 episodes. Like, I haven't even finished 2K17, so that'll make it a 5th episode, because by the time I actually get to 2K17, I will at least be in 2K18. But that's not a whole lot, only 5 episodes of a series, so how frequently these are going to come out, I guess it depends on the reception as well. Like, if you guys really want to see the next episode, I might try to get that out quicker, because the idea with this series as well, because it is so long, there's no real way that I could possibly have, like, with Pretend It Never Happened, what could have happened, the edits per minute is there's a lot more in terms of visual edits. With this series, it's more of, like, just kind of a podcast. So yeah, I am going to show footage from, like, I'm going to show relevant footage from these shows, but I'm not going to go into showing footage from every individual detail that I talk about, because this is a long video. Part of the issue with that is that I don't have a lot of my older footage because my old computer didn't have a lot of memory, and because I didn't have like an external hard drive at the time. Like right now I have a 2 terabyte external hard drive that I store most of my videos on. But even then, that's just 2K15, 2K16, 2K17 stuff. The visual quality of my older videos is so bad as well that I really don't care if I don't have those videos. Like, I have copies of the really important stuff, like episode 0, my very first episode. I have that because that's a big thing. So if my YouTube channel were to ever get taken down, I would want to have that. But if, you know, really, if all of my WWE 13 Universe mode just suddenly tomorrow was gone, it would suck. But I wouldn't stress out like immensely in trying to recover that garbage, because yeah, I like having the garbage there because it shows my progression, it shows you where I've come from, and it's just the journey of my journey as a content creator. But if I lost it, I could live with it. I wouldn't be happy about it, but I could live with it. Whereas like my newer stuff, if I lost that, I would be pissed. I'd be furious, which is why I have it backed up on a hard drive, and I still have copies on my actual laptop now, because obviously I need the footage for the videos I talk about now. But I'm going on, that was a tangent. I don't know why I had to throw that in at the end, but I'll let you guys go. I'm hitting the hour mark. I'm sure I've cut stuff out, so it's not quite an hour, but thank you for joining me for this first episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this is a concept that interests you. It's the recap. It's also got a little bit of a competitive vibe to it. Like, was Raw or SmackDown better? And where do I need to make improvements moving forward? So thank you for joining me for like the umpteenth time. And until next time, keep on YouTubing.